Welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thank you for joining me. If this is your first time here, you just happen to have fell across this channel, well, it's a crime channel and it's very consistent. I release content on a Wednesday and a Sunday. So if you like crime and consistency, this is the channel for you. Also, shout out to all of you who are my regulars. Thank you for joining me. If you haven't joined me for a live chat yet, I premiere each video twice a week. So I'm usually present. We all have a good old natter and get involved with crime conversations in Kenny's crime cult. So do join me if you haven't joined me before. Also, massive shout out to Patreon because you are amazing. And the reason that I'm able to do more and more of this content is because you guys allow me the opportunity to do, so that really matters to me. Thank you. Same for anybody who leaves me a comment, a like, write something interesting that I kind of learn from, or gives me a subscription. All of those things make a massive difference to my life and content creation. Also, I am obviously wearing merch. This is Kenny's crime cult. Have quite a few now. No comments coming, along with a few other bits and bobs. Thanks for all the feedback on the merch that you're getting. I really appreciate it. It's great. We make it. So it makes us feel like at the end of the day, it's personal, it's an exchange with you guys, and you appreciate it. But also, I use the word we, and I'm a liar. I mean Pete, my husband, who does all the editing and everything, and makes this channel miles better than it would be without just me alone. So the reality is a big thanks to him as well. I don't do that a lot. You're all very nice, and I do like the hashtags free dusted because there is a strong suggestion in many of your minds that he may be living in my basement and not allowed out very often. That would be interesting. In the future, somebody could do a true crime video on me being somebody who kept my husband in the basement. Am I lying? Or is it just psychological manipulation and he really is in the basement? Well, you won't know, at least not for now. The case that I'm going to cover today, just going to say, guys, get ready to be on the edge of your seats. I'm hoping that you haven't heard of it. If you have, don't let the cat out of the bag. That's all I'm saying. If you happen to have heard of this case before, you be quiet. Stop your fingers from typing. I know how much you know. Just say it. Keep it together. Let's just let everyone imagine that we haven't heard this before. So today I'm going to be covering the crimes committed by Wayne Nance. Wayne Nance was born on the 18th of October 1995 in Missoula, Montana. He had 4 siblings. He was brought up in a relatively poor environment. He had a poor upbringing. He was raised in a mobile home on the outskirts of town, so it wasn't an easy childhood. They certainly didn't have a lot of money, they didn't have luxuries, etc. And to some degree, I would imagine it was challenging as a child growing up in such a situation because, let's be honest, kids can be quite nasty to you, and other people in different situations who may have more than you can cast aspersions on your upbringing, and that's always going to make you feel a little bit of an outsider. We can all accept that. Actually, a lot of us will probably be able to relate to it. So nonetheless, it wasn't a perfect start to his life. His father, he was a trucker, so that means he was often on the road. And even though that can be problematic on an obvious level because we all want our primary caregivers around, and even when somebody's got a job and there is a worthy reason for them to be away, when you're a boy growing up, it is kind of handy having your father around. There's a lot of male energy where children are concerned, and having a dad who's able to kick a ball around with you and guide you and mentor you and so on and so forth, it's just helpful. I was a single mum. Shout out to all the ladies who are there doing it themselves. I also appreciate we're amazing. I'm just saying that if there is a father involved, then it can be really helpful just to have that energy that is displaced by that relationship. Unfortunately, even though his father was away on the road quite a lot, it wasn't like he was a perfect dad. He had really violent tendencies, so there was quite a lot of abuse when he was growing up. And his mum, Charlene, she was a waitress, so she held down a job, but she also had big issues with alcohol. Again, when you've got a parent who's dealing with dependency issues, we all know the reality of that. You have a relationship primarily with the dependency. It doesn't mean that you don't love your children. It certainly doesn't mean that you don't want to be a good parent for them. But unfortunately, your dependency gets in the way of that. So Wayne was growing up in a challenging position with abuse, dependency, and poverty. It's not an easy situation for any child per se. Another issue was that as Nance was growing up, he and his siblings were often left alone unsupervised at home whilst his parents were working. Times have changed. with respect. And even in today's modern age, there is still some kind of uncertainty about what is considered appropriate when it comes down to leaving children at home. There is kind of a rule of thumb that if a child is 13, it's acceptable to leave them at home. And actually, at 13, to be in charge of other children at home. And because even in the UK and Western world, social services will often look and say, what is appropriate? It's not because they think that a 13-year-old is necessarily in a great situation where they can accommodate bringing up their siblings. It's more that parents work and sometimes childcare is a problem, and therefore there has to be an almost accepted level of how vulnerable would this child be in this certain situation. So it's not universally agreed on, but they tend to say around 13 there is an acceptability level of a child being left at home by themselves and sometimes being left at home with other children around them. However, in this case, we're talking about much younger kids. Again, it was a long time ago. So the reality of that is that the world as we know it was probably very different. There is nothing unusual for children being left at home to fend for themselves whilst parents were working. So, December 1964. Nance's father, who we already know has had problems and we recognise as not being an ideal primary caregiver, gets convicted of armed robbery. That's a big deal, isn't it? A parent to actually get convicted of a felony like that. And he gets 5 years. So that's a relatively long time for a child to suddenly be without a parent, isn't it? I mean, a month is a long time when you're a kid. Summer holidays, when I was a kid, lasted for 33 years. That's how you feel when you're a child, because you don't have responsibilities like paying the mortgage and cooking for other people and caring for everything and making sure that you don't get your car taken off you because you forgot to tax it. Those things take up a lot of time when you get to be an adult, but when you're a child, you don't have it. So you just have these endless hours, right? So 5 years to a child would be an absolutely enormous amount of time to comprehend. And we're talking sometimes like double the lifespan of what a child's already existed within. So for Nance, losing his father at this moment in time would have been very challenging, no matter how challenging the relationship had been. Now, all of this is going on within his childhood, his early childhood. Now, this is an unorthodox upbringing. The points that we have covered demonstrate that we would expect to see attachment issues, abandonment issues, potential internalised rage, vulnerability. All of these things are being fostered in such circumstances. And what we might also expect to see with respect is when a child is in school and they have this range of things that could be considered incapacitating for them, that they would struggle. There would be issues around their education, and it's not the case where Nance is concerned. In fact, despite his completely unorthodox upbringing, he was an excellent student. He excelled. So he excelled throughout school. He graduated from Bonner Elementary School and Sentinel High School in 1974. But in spite of being considered an absolute standout student, intelligence-wise, there were issues, quite obviously, within his nature, aside from the academic. He had a very volatile temper. When people reflected on how they would describe him, they described Nance as a troublemaker. He was known to start fights with other boys. And also he would do things that were malicious. So whilst he would have the physical altercation with boys, when it came to girls, they weren't safe, so to speak. What he would do there, he'd break items belonging to them. He'd take things of meaning and destroy them. So on one level, we have the physical domination and bullying of other boys and peers. And on the other side, we have this desire equally to dominate girls, but not physically at this point. But clearly this desire to manipulate other people's feelings in a negative way. One recollection of him, and I always talk about this when we start exploring the traits of, shall we say, potential serial killers. We look at the McDonald triad. The McDonald triad says that we will see things like pyromania, setting fire to things, chronic enuresis, wetting the bed, and also violence towards animals. And the violence towards animal ones in particularly always provoke a real reaction for me. Certainly on the very odd occasion that I was referred a young adult who was torturing and killing animals, it was the biggest red flag I would ever experience in therapy. And actually, therapeutically, it's probably one of the things I found the most challenging. I mean, you come to see me, I'm somebody who doesn't harm animals, we don't eat animals, we've had nothing to do with animal harm for a very long time, and actually working with clients on very odd occasions who were very dangerous towards animals, and understanding that even though not all people who harm animals become serial killers or even violent adults with respect, a large proportion of individuals who do go out of their way to cause great harm to animals have what I would consider, and certainly what research would evidence, violent tendencies that can become criminal in the future. And what Wayne Nance did on one occasion was he found a box of kittens. Now, to us in modern day, it doesn't happen very often. But I look back at my childhood and people were always drowning kittens. In fact, I rescued 6 kittens and rehoused them because my friend's mum was going to do that. I also pretended to rehouse all of them, but I actually kept 2. And I had them in my dad's garage and I managed to look after them for over 2 months before it was discovered. And he said I'd have to get rid of them, and then I had them forever. So that didn't happen at all. I got to keep them. What I'm saying is, back in my day, it actually happened a lot that people were really nasty towards puppies and kittens that they didn't want. They just got rid of them. So it wasn't unusual that people would come across boxes of kittens, boxes of puppies. But he does. And for me, the natural proclivity that we all have is to protect. They look sweet, they look cute, they're helpless, they're vulnerable. You go out of your way to figure a way forward so that you can protect these animals. He actually just got the box. And this is when he's a young person, guys. He got the box and he placed it in an incinerator and he turned it on. So he knowingly and willingly got these defenseless creatures, put them in an incinerator and set fire to them and burnt them alive. That is a big red flag, and certainly indicative of future potential violent behaviour. So we can say that he's quite an unusual character at this point. Obviously, he has elements that are drawing our attention to future psychological problems and actions. But equally, we can say, well, he's very, very bright and he's excelling at school and he's succeeded on that level. So there seems to be a mix of possibility and potential right now where he could potentially go one way or the other. I also want it noted that he wasn't unpopular. So amongst his peers, in spite of all of the violence and issues and the negative behaviours, he was still relatively popular. In fact, he was reflected as being well-liked amongst the local population. So there's something about his character, isn't there? He's potentially charismatic. He finds it easy to engage with people, in spite of these odd predilections that he has that are rather dark. Similarly, he's able to transverse those behaviours to connect with people who know him around him, which makes him fit in. And think about our organised serial killers. What do our organised serial killers have in common? Well, they're very bright, tend to have had some kind of abuse when they're being brought up, torture animals, but are incredibly effective at convincing people around them that they're relatively good human beings. They're chameleons. So I would say at this point, with our knowledge about him, we're certainly getting that insight, aren't we, that he's ticking some of those boxes. Also, as a teenager, well, he becomes obsessed with the occult. Again, ting, ting, ting. Think Richard Ramirez, for example. A lot of our serial killers, a lot of our deeply violent perpetrators have this obsession early on with the occult. And actually, he would go around and really boast about worshipping Satan. He wasn't embarrassed about it. He wanted people to know about it. And I get it. We've all been there. I was a goth. Everybody's had a little look into things like Ouija boards and tarot and runes, and all of those things are completely normal, right? But when somebody is actively going around and saying, I am a Satanist, again, I think it just draws our attention to one of two things. Either they are desperate to stand out. That's not unusual, particularly in adolescence. We're all looking to stand out a little bit. It's really hard to find visibility as a young person. There are so many of us and we're all trying to be unique, and often we don't know how to present ourselves in a way that makes others see us. So when people take on these kind of belief systems, often it is for attention, and that's not a bad thing. Everyone needs attention in some way, shape or form. But it could be a much more sinister part in that story, which is that genuinely he's looking at what Satan stands for. He's looking around what Satanism is about, which, let's be honest, at the very broad spectrum can be the dark satanic rituals around wanting to be involved with more negative traits and behaviours, to the idea of things like sacrifice. So there is a spectrum, and certainly it's not a spectrum that is light. It's not one where you can go around and say, oh, that's Satanism stuff. It's all about protecting my neighbours and looking after the homeless. You're not going to find that in the text, is all I'm saying. So the fact that he's practicing this, or at least telling people he is, says that he wants people to know about his potential. He's not hiding behind this perfect position of being a good human being, is he? And once he actually used a hot coat hanger to brand himself with satanic symbols. On one level we can say, well, that's self-harm. Maybe he was dealing with quite a lot of pain because his upbringing had been really problematic and he was dealing with quite serious abandonment issues by his father and he was lost. And so branding himself with satanic images and symbols, well, that demonstrates the level of emotional pain potentially. Or let's just throw in the other side. He just wants everyone to know that he is very different to them and has a great deal more potential for harm than they would. And just to bring in the evidence that we have from psychopaths and research around psychopaths, if you are a psychopath, not only do you not have empathy in the way that you or I would have empathy, that's to do, remember, empathy with understanding pain of others at times. So empathy is to be able to look at somebody else, read what's going on, and whilst you don't absolutely feel the same experience, you identify with the emotions. So if you're crying and unhappy and upset, I feel that feeling. I want to connect with you on that and I want to help you work that through. Equally, psychopaths don't have that potential. And it's almost the same when it comes down to the pain spectrum physically. So there is some evidence to say that if you are a psychopath and you hurt yourself, you don't feel it in the same way that you would if you were a typical human being. Your pain threshold is higher. Draw to your attention, murderer, Joanna Dennehy. Please feel free to go through the video on her. She's a great example of somebody who was dealing with a particular sexual paraphilia and she enjoyed a great deal inflicting wounds on herself. It was not to deal with pain, it was to create pleasure. So just to bring that in as a possibility. Also, he became massively obsessed with knives. Think Ted Bundy. He was obsessed with knives by 3 years of age. By 3. I don't even think I knew what a knife was at 3 years of age, but similarly, Nance became obsessed with knives. And he would often bring them into school, show his classmates. I once took my dad's whistle into school. Do you remember when you were a kid? Don't know whether it's the same in America and Canada and wherever else, but when I was a child, the teacher would whistle once. This is when I was a young kid, like maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And at that point, everyone would have to freeze. Then they'd blow it again, and everyone had to queue up. Yeah? My dad had one of those whistles, and I thought about it for a long time when I was about 5. And then one day I thought, I'm going to take that whistle to school. And I did. And let me tell you, do I have any regrets that about 3 minutes before the whistle should have gone, that I blew the whistle and everyone froze? And then I blew the whistle again and everyone lined up and yes, they took that whistle off me. Do I have any regrets whatsoever? No. It was a wonderful moment. What I'm saying is, we all have our interests, don't we? But knives is not the normal type that you would have as a child. And yes, to those of you out there thinking, is Emma a bit of a control freak? I think probably I was. I also remember that memory with just joy, absolute joy. Total power and domination for about 8 seconds. Wonderful. Anyway, we're getting a lot of introductions here, aren't we, to problematic behaviour. And the thing about knives is, it wasn't just that he took knives into school. At one point, it appears that he took things to another level because he took in with him a hypodermic needle and he actually stabbed a boy in a leg with it. So again, even though that wasn't knifing him, it's that same intention, isn't it? It's the willingness to inflict harm on another person's body that wasn't invited in any way, shape or form. And when he was a young guy growing up, teenager in particular, he was constantly bragging that he wanted to kill somebody before he was 19. Just a point here. If you happen to be around somebody who's bragging that they want to kill somebody before 19, call the emergency services. Honestly, a little bit of advice there. If somebody's saying, I think I want to kill somebody before I'm 19, don't think it's high jinks. It's not normal to say that stuff. And that's how we would prevent people getting killed Genuinely, the amount of cases I've covered where people have literally been saying, I am going to kill somebody, and everyone's like, oh, he's just having a laugh. No, that's not what people say when they're having a laugh. It's what people say when they're quite deeply disturbed, and we should definitely act on it. He also made it clear that one of the reasons that he wanted to kill was because he wanted to make a human sacrifice. So again, we've got that connection with the Satanism. This isn't just about Nance standing out. This is about Nance developing a very clear predilection with the dark thoughts and also the identity with where he wants and wishes to go with those dark thoughts. Now, the same year that he graduated his high school, Nance is living with his parents. That's George and Charlene, and that's in Tamarack Trailer Park. Now, nearby, there was the Pounds West Riverside family home. So there was neighbours nearby, the Pounds. That was Donna and Harvey Pounds. They were a middle-aged couple. Donna worked part-time at a Christian bookstore and Harvey worked in a men's shoe store. And one of the things that we know about them was they were an incredibly religious couple. So they were really good people. They had a small life, a local life, a good life, a moral life. Harvey was actually the deacon of the local Bethel Baptist Church, and Nance was actually somebody who knew their teenage son. In fact, he was known to be a regular visitor at their home, so he was there often. They had 3 children. That was 20-year-old Karen, 12-year-old Kathy, and teenager Kenny. Now, the glimpses that we have had so far of Nance's, what we would all, I think, agree on is a peculiar character and also short temper. We know he's been violent to other people. They are mere glimpses of the potential of this man. These are mere glimpses of a far sinister nature. Because this man wasn't just an animal torturer. He wasn't just an individual who was involved in petty criminality. He wasn't just somebody who liked upsetting people. He wasn't just somebody who was trying to be a bit out there being a Satanist. This man was showing you glimpses of who was going to grow into a serial rapist and murderer in the making. In fact, that man, the boy that we're talking about right now, would become known as the Missoula Mauler. The Missoula Mauler, which in itself is an absolutely terrifying name, isn't it? Also, you might be frustrated at this point for me to tell you this, but he's never ever going to get convicted of any of his crimes. So just preparing you, there isn't going to be an outcome where this man ever gets convicted of his crimes. And I know that's going to disappoint you, but just stay with me. When Nance's really violent offending behaviour begins, we don't actually know for sure. That's the truth. What we can say is a proclivity for it was evident from pretty much the get-go, okay? But we don't necessarily know those first crimes. It is suspected Donna was his first victim, okay? So the Pounds family are considered where the killing begins. And it seems to be that this is where we can absolutely draw a conclusion that his MO becomes associated with his crimes. So first of all, the way he would commit crimes was with a home invasion. Then he'd kill any man in the house. Then he would restrain, rape and kill women. And usually he would kill them with multiple shots to the head using a .32 caliber pistol. And that's very similar, isn't it, to Richard Ramirez? In fact, a very similar MO. Getting into the home, killing the male so there's no fights, taking time with the women and then killing the women. So very similar MO in that way, but this seems to be where his begins. So looking at that first crime, it was the early afternoon, April the 11th, 1974, and actually a neighbour records spotting a man who looked like Nance in the backyard of the Pounds family home. Also, whoever it was that they felt could be Nance was carrying a black gym bag. Now, 39-year-old Donna Pounds arrives home just around 1:30 p.m. It is believed that at this point, the perpetrator was potentially already in the family home, wearing latex gloves and in possession of lengths of white clothesline, so organised. Turned up there, knowing what that person intended to do, so to speak, and was prepared. Now, Donna's husband and eldest daughter are at work, and Kenny is serving in the army. And then there's also 12-year-old Kathy who's at school. So obviously Donna's on her own. The man who's in that place, albeit that somebody says later looked a bit like Nance, at this point we don't know whether it is. But whoever it was in that home had managed to retrieve Harvey's semi-automatic Luger pistol. So Donna's husband's Luger pistol has been retrieved. And he's waiting for Donna's arrival. He accosts Donna in the bedroom, fires a warning shot into the wall. Obviously, what are you going to do psychologically in that moment? You're dealing with somebody who's just in that space. You don't know who they are, or you might know who they are, but the point is, what are you going to do about it? Because they are armed and dangerous. I mean, the truth is, in that scenario, you have one of two opportunities. You either scream and run and hope that they don't shoot you, or you comply. And as we know, a lot of victims will comply because they feel that the likelihood is they will live if they do that. Often they're wrong, but it's a completely normal psychological process to just freeze and then comply. He then tied her arms and legs to the bedpost, spreads eagles her legs essentially with clothesline. Then he rapes her. So he's taking his time. This isn't a rushed job. He's not expecting people home. That's important. Because if you're not expecting people home, the likelihood is you have intel. And if you have intel, it's probably because you know them. So the very fact that we can see this means that there is a strong possibility the perpetrator is known to the family. He then takes her to the basement, ties her up, forces her to her knees after the most violating, humiliating, horror-filled rape that she's just been through. And he shoots her 5 times in the back of the head. 5 times. Now that's overkill, isn't it? That's about wanting to destroy. Because if you're going to shoot somebody 5 times in the back of the head, 1, you know they're going to die. But 2, imagine the state of the way they will look to the people who find them. It's a power play, isn't it? It's a domination. He then poses a body, and he in fact inserts the barrel of the gun into her vagina. So he humiliates the corpse. And again, what is that telling the person who is about to walk in and find the body of their loved one in such a state? And that's incredibly important to remember, because what we're seeing here isn't just this absolute capacity for violence. We're seeing this capacity for manipulation and that Machiavellian malevolence of wishing to do somebody such traumatic psychological damage when they find their loved one. So it's multifaceted, the way that he's carried this out. Now, when Harvey, Donna's husband, returns home that evening, first of all, he's met with white clothesline tied to several beds in the home. So instantly he can see something isn't right. Then he notices his empty gun holster is out. Well, he keeps that locked in a secret drawer. So instantly he knows that the only people who should know where that is he and his family. And the gun was missing. So now not only has he got all these white clothesline, his gun's missing, the drawer's open, and he starts searching. And that's when he finds his wife's body in the basement. I can't even imagine what would be running through that man's head. His wife has been killed with his own gun. Now, Nance would never be prosecuted for this offence, but that eyewitness description from the neighbour was obviously something that led police to think, well, there's a potential it could be him. But also, it's really important to note, Nance knew where Harvey's gun was, because Kenny, Harvey's son, had shown him exactly where his father kept it. It's what kids do, isn't it? You're kind of proud when your dad's got a gun and things that are a bit different. And you know, it's boys' play, isn't it, to kind of big that up and show friends what it is and where it is. So Nance knew. So we've got those two things, those indicators. They're only circumstantial, but it's certainly enough to make Nance a suspect. However, like in a lot of cases, and so many of you who watch true crime all the time will be aware, that when there is a homicide, and when it seems to be in a situation where there is little reason for anyone else to come in and harm that person, it tends to be that guilt is primarily put onto their partners. It tends to be somebody within the home that we imagine has carried it out. And that's good reason, because massively statistically it is, because we don't like the idea that somebody could just walk in off the street and rape and murder somebody randomly, right? So the police start suspecting initially that it's Donna's husband, Harvey. So there's two reasons why they think that Harvey might be the person who's killed his wife. Firstly, Donna had been killed with his gun. And obviously we know that his gun was meant to be locked somewhere quite secret. And two, it turns out he's having an affair with a member of his congregation, which is always going to be an indicator for the police to think, well, maybe it was just a crime of convenience. He wanted to get rid of his wife so he could establish a relationship with the person he's having an affair with. So they are the reasons why a certain amount of doubt is cast upon Harvey. So police do feel at this point, okay, Harvey is the likely candidate for being the murderer, but in spite of that, they couldn't pin it on him because there really was insufficient evidence to prosecute him. Nonetheless, this means that Nance isn't the person fully under the radar. Now, Nance is interviewed by the police, and of course he's like, I know nothing. I was out all day finding materials to build a tomahawk for the school project. Anyway, the school do later confirm that the project had been completed earlier in the year. So it's not necessarily fitting together, but for whatever reason, that doesn't seem to provoke a red flag that makes them feel the need to look further into it. Although, during that episode of interviewing him and kind of exploring the potential of other criminals being involved, they searched Nance's home and they did find a pair of his blood-stained underwear that had recently been washed by his mother. Is it just me? Is it just me? If I was his mother and I found some blood-stained underwear, I would not wash them. I would get into my child's room and I would say, why is there blood-stained underwear? And if my child did not show me a substantial injury that he'd caused himself, we would be going to the police. Because it is not normal to find blood-stained underwear unless there is an injury or unless you've caused an injury to somebody else. Now, even though she'd washed it, it wouldn't really have mattered at that point because unfortunately DNA testing in 1974 was by basic sci-fi. It hadn't happened. We thought about potentials, but it hadn't been systematically created. So we didn't have the opportunity to do that. But it was enough probably to provoke again some concerns by the police that this was not normal. To find this kind of stuff in this young man's bedroom was not really something that felt like it was boding well for him. Also, it took a decade before DNA testing could be used to solve crimes. So we are a whole decade before that. What I would say is the bloodstain was identified as human, but they couldn't establish who it was. However, what they did find was a black gym bag and a .22 caliber bullet. So the very fact that that neighbour had seen somebody with a black gym bag outside the home does suggest that there's a strong link. Now, he was definitely considered a likely suspect, but they could not find conclusive physical evidence to connect him to the crime. Also, at that point, with respect to the police, they said, well, if you're telling the truth, would you take a polygraph test? And Nance, well, he agreed. However, what we didn't know is in between him agreeing and doing the test, he spent a while studying lie detectors and how to pass them. And he passed them. So that really frustrated the police because there was a lot of circumstantial evidence. There wasn't evidence that directly linked him with the crime, but there was certainly enough to potentially look at bringing a case. But when you get that negative polygraph test, you're going to have an issue, not because they're admissible in court, but because it creates a bias, doesn't it? If somebody passes a polygraph test, you can't help but think to yourself, well, if we believe in them, this kid's probably innocent. Also worth noting that lie detector tests are not conclusive by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't matter what show you watch and they're like, he was being deceptive. He was not being deceptive. Lie detectors are around 60% useful. That's why they're not admissible in court. However, there are some incredible FBI staff and in the UK similar where they are so good at reading people that with the polygraph test and the questioning, you can kind of say, well, this person is likely being deceptive or non-deceptive. But like I said, it is certainly not an absolute science. And also, we know that psychopaths often can pass these tests because they don't have an issue with lying. So you're not going to get some kind of sweat response because they really don't care. Simple as that. So Donna's horrible murder basically becomes a cold case. So this poor woman who'd never done anything wrong in her life, who'd literally lived a law-abiding, moral, Christian experience, gets horribly raped and murdered, and then the case just goes cold, which must have been horrific for her family. Now, Nance's investigation by the police meant that a lot of people locally started to think there is something wrong with this man. You know, he's a young guy. He's already been indicated as potentially being involved in a homicide and rape. So the community, understandably, start putting a wide berth around him, and he gets stigmatised in the community. So the same year that Donna's murdered, Nance makes a decision to follow actually Donna's son's steps and goes and joins the forces. So he enrolls in the Navy. Now, at this point, again, this is the belief that he was likely killing people whilst he was travelling on Navy service. I always say this about criminals. If you are somebody with a predilection for wishing to kill, are you going to do it in your local area, or you're going to create a life for yourself where you have options to do it elsewhere? It's going to be far more difficult for people to pin things on you if you're travelling around. Certainly if you're an individual in the Navy as well, because very few people are going to be looking at you as a potential killer. Actually, people have a bias that if you're in the services, you're somebody who wants to serve and protect, but it gives him access. And I think for somebody who is killed in such a horrific way as they have Donna, the chances are this activation of him now fully being a killer is not something that will have gone away. And yes, there will be cooling off periods. We know that with serial killers. They don't kill all the time, but it's likely that he had the option, the availability, the vulnerable people, and the desirable opportunities to go ahead and kill. Now, he did ultimately get discharged on the grounds of misconduct. That was 3 years later in 1977. The reason for that is he was found in possession of knives, drugs, and stolen items. So the criminality, even though he's serving in the Navy, is clearly ever present. 1979. There's a body of a young woman found sexually assaulted and stabbed in the chest. Now, railway workers actually discovered her body, and it's on the road banking near Nance's home city of Missoula. She was basically found leaning against a chain link fence. She had no shoes or underwear on. Her skirt had been hitched up around her neck, and there was a clear evidence of sexual assault, but the decomposition was so severe they couldn't actually identify initially who she was. There were no matches in missing person files, but she was white and she was also wearing a flower print dress. Now, she was dubbed as Betty Beavertail because her body was discovered near Beavertail Hill State Park. Her body would not be identified until 1985. And when she was identified, it turned out to be the body of missing 15-year-old girl Devonna Nelson. She was a runaway, just hitching through Missoula from Seattle, and she'd gone missing around the same time that Nance had visited the city, so clear link there. Now, in the summer of 1984, Nance starts dating a young woman known only as Robin. Now, she's from out of town, and she claimed to be from Texas. Now, he basically found her at a truck stop. She'd been left there by another driver that she'd argued with, and he takes her in, shall we say. So they dated during the summer of 1984. Now, he later claimed that that relationship ended when she left town in the September. But whenever he was asked about her departure, he was very vague. It wasn't that he kind of had this solid reasoning. In fact, he would change the story as to why she wasn't involved in his life anymore. But basically, she just disappears. And that in itself was concerning, isn't it? Because we also know at this point that this is a man with a very high proclivity for violence. Now, around this time, Nance is working as a bouncer at the Cabin Bar in East Missoula. I know that most bouncers are not aggressive, violent human beings. However, if you want a job with a permission base for violence because you have that potential predilection, it's a good job for you, right? You get to rough people up without getting into trouble. And whilst he's working in this place, women in the area just start disappearing. Simple as that. Just randomly start disappearing. Now, it's believed that Nance used that workplace to select his victims. And again, I think a lot of us who've ever been nightclubbing, when you're a young person, there's a lot of hero worship towards bouncers. You know, they're the people who let you in. If you get to know them, you tend to get some favours done. It's one of those situations where you apply a particular attraction towards them. I don't mean you actually are attracted physically to them. I mean an attraction towards them character-wise, because you know that if they like you, you get certain benefits. So if you happen to be, shall we say, a raping serial killer, and you want to have access to young women in particular, it's the perfect position to create trust and opportunity. So years later, after he had worked there and after these women just basically disappeared, hand-drawn floor plans to houses of local women, which featured, by the way, detailed drawings of the interiors, would be discovered in Nance's home. Literally, like descriptions that no one else could have known unless they'd been in those homes. Nance had drawings of all of these. So that tells you, doesn't it, that either he had access because women were letting him into those homes, or was he stalking them? Was he breaking and entering? Was he figuring things out? Was he working much like BTK Dennis Radar used to? Really trawling through and locking in and figuring out when he was going to strike. Because part of the fantasy is that, isn't it? He might not have killed all of the women whose homes that he'd drawn out. It's the fact that he knew he could. He was living with that fantasy, the idea of potential. And that would certainly be something that I think we can all agree on if he's got these kind of scripts that he's created regarding the layouts of their homes. So on the 24th of December 1984 in Missoula, a wildlife photographer is out taking photos, and they come across a human foot just sticking out of a frozen ground in the woodland of Deer Creek. That was 2 miles from Nance's home. So the police are called, and they unearth the body of an unidentified young woman, basically, in a shallow grave. Again, she's really badly decomposed. 3 gunshot wounds to her head. And they thought when they looked at the body, she'd been dead for around 3 months. But again, just couldn't match it with any missing person files. This is a real problem because they don't have links, because they don't even have a name. So there's no identification, and the police end up calling her Debbie Deer Creek. Again, it's not until years later, in fact 2006, that body was finally identified as 16-year-old Marcella Bachman. And the reason that they were able to do that is they used DNA evidence. So she had basically run away from home in Vancouver. She'd been having just those classic teenage conflicts, really, with other family members. And she'd made a decision to just leave. And that's so sad, because that decision ultimately led to her death. Now, when people were asked about the character of this girl, they described her as kind, as gentle, and as very, very loving. So she was an individual who society would have benefited from. And every individual who's murdered has unbelievable worth to our world. But I think when you hear about those kind of character traits, then people can kind of describe somebody as just being this holistically lovely human being, maybe too sensitive to a point where they remove themselves from the family because they feel conflict is difficult to bear, and then they end up in the mouth of a lion. That in itself is devastating. And her brother Derek, with the help actually of a private investigator, they had been searching for her for years. And again, it just breaks your heart. Because here we have this girl who left home, who obviously didn't feel that she could sustain and live in that environment, and yet her brother had never stopped searching for her. You know, there was obviously a real loving bond there. He also, during that search with the private investigator, had found out that one of the ways she'd been supporting herself was because she was a prostitute, and that's how she'd managed to financially protect herself. So when they found out about the fact that she disappeared, there were thoughts that she could have been a victim of the Green River Killer, which is Gary Ridgway. He killed 24 sex workers and runaways. And Marcella was known to use the alias Robin. Yeah, she was the same Robin that Nance had taken in and dated. So a 29-year-old Nance had at that point been in a relationship with a 16-year-old girl. I know it's legal. I appreciate it's legal in the UK, probably isn't legal in the States because they have more rigorous issues around age of consent. But in the UK, he wouldn't be considered a paedophile. But nonetheless, for me, 29 versus 16, it's a whole world away, isn't it? And it certainly says something about Nance likely wishing to dominate partners, manipulate partners, and feel in control of them. Also, as we've said, Nance had claimed that Robin had left town around the same time that Marcella was killed. So he'd made this situation unfold where his girlfriend Robin, not Marcella, even though they're the same person, had just skipped town at this surprising point where when they tracked back when the body had been found and when it had actually died was likely the fact that Marcella was killed at the same time as Robin. Obviously, we all know here, it was Robin, Marcella was her. And the likelihood is, therefore, that he was the murderer. Simple as that. Just made a story up, said she skipped town, but really had killed her. September 1985, well, a local hunter's out tracking a bear he'd shot. I know people are okay with that. I hate the idea of somebody going out and tracking a bear. It's irrelevant. I'm not doing an animal rights video. It just hurts my heart a little bit that a hunter was out tracking a bear he'd already shot. Obviously not very well as he was tracking it because it was still moving. Nonetheless, I digress. So whilst this hunter is out looking for his bear, he comes across these skeletal remains and they're all scattered across a hillside in Crystal Creek, West Missoula. This was 3 miles from where Marcella's body is found. And again, when the police come and do the investigation, they say it's definitely a homicide and it has the same MO. 2 .32 caliber bullets to the head. Again, there's no personal items or ID, so it's hard to find out who these people are that bodies are turning up. So they nicknamed this body Crystal Creek. When the forensics explored where she was from, who she may be, because remember this was in a state of complete decomposition, it was just bones and so on and so forth, they decided that there was a likelihood that she was probably of Asian ethnicity. First of all, it was because they said she'd have wavy brown hair. They thought she was aged around 18 to 35. She was between 4'10" and 5'2" inches tall. She weighed around 100 pounds, so only about 7 stone, very petite. Also, one of the indicators for why they thought that she may have had an Asian descent was because of the dental work that she had. It had only been practiced in Asia, so they assumed that that was the case. It was the screwing of the dental post into her mouth. Also, they were able to decipher that she smoked and that she had quite a lot of fillings and 2 root canals. They found out from examination that she was likely left-handed, and they were able to establish that they thought she died between 83 and 1985. But aside from that, that was all they could basically decipher. Decades of work with forensic anthropologists and odontologists, hours of research in missing persons databases would follow, and yet the mystery of that body would remain so for nearly 36 years. It wasn't that people gave up, it was just that it was so difficult to figure out where this individual came from and who they were. And that carried on until May this year, till 2021. So after years, and I mean years, of intense genealogy research, DNA, relatives, family trees, all of these things that got identified, and obviously we see that all the time, that nowadays you can literally give your DNA in and suddenly you're getting hooked up with all these people that you're related to that you never heard of. So incredible advancements, but also really helpful for these Jane Does and John Does who just turn up and no one knows who they are. And then suddenly there's a link to this DNA. And through that, investigators are led to the Lucas family in Spokane, Washington. So the DNA testing of relatives confirmed that she was 23-year-old Janet G. Lucas. She had a 5-year-old son at the time of her death. He'd spent most of his adult life searching for her. How heartbreaking. Again, another individual that just disappeared, who nobody knew related or belonged to anyone. But they were so loved that their disappearance marked a whole new chapter in their family's lives of searching for this loved one. When these individuals kill people and steal them, they leave this ripple and web of devastation. And the truth is that her son had spent his adult life just looking for his mother. Also, it turned out that as much as they thought that she was of Asian descent, they were wrong. In fact, she wasn't. She'd last been seen in the summer of 1983 in Sandpoint, Idaho. To be fair, no one actually knew how or why she ended up in Montana. And her family later stated she never spent one moment without being loved. Janet had a contagious smile, warm personality, and wore her heart on her sleeve. It has never actually been established, by the way, that Nance did kill Janet. However, what I will tell you is he literally still remains the only suspect. And with respect, as far as I am concerned, looking at the anecdotal and circumstantial evidence and also past history, I think we all agree that it's very likely he was her murderer. Now, on the evening of the 12th of December 1985, Mike and Teresa Shook are at home in Hamilton. This is in Ravalli County, Montana. They've basically recently bought a house, they've furnished it with purchases from Collins Furniture Store in Missoula. A 30-year-old Nance worked there at the time. He works as a delivery driver in the warehouse, so he's basically been the person who's delivered their furniture 2.5 weeks earlier. They've just finished dinner. All of a sudden they hear this loud banging on the front door. They also have a 4-year-old son, Luke, and he runs there to the front door, as kids do, and he answers it before his parents could react. And when that child answers the door swings open and this man walks in with a gun, demands money. And then he says to them, no one's going to get hurt. All you've got to do is to comply. What do I say to all of you guys? What's the rule? What's the rule? Don't comply. Never comply. I'm telling you, the one bit of advice from my channel in these circumstances: scream, run, throw, get out, do anything you can. Don't comply, because the truth is, if you comply, you are at their mercy. I always say, a would-be robber is not going to kill you. Even a rapist is not going to kill you. The people who are going to kill you are the people who are out to kill you. Don't comply. Again, it's believed that one of the ways that he subdued them was he fired off warning shots. Now, unintentionally, that actually hit Teresa in the leg. It also seems that she was trying to dig that bullet out when it had occurred. So there was obviously a period of time where she's trying to get this bullet out of her leg. A scuffle breaks out between the intruder and Mike. Mike gets beaten horribly around the head, then he gets tied up, and he was stabbed in his chest with a butcher's knife, and then he was killed. The intruder then grabs Teresa, drags her upstairs, ties her up, puts Luke, the little boy, in his brother's room, and then placed 2-year-old Megan in a crib in his parents' room. He then rapes Teresa on the bed next to the crib before stabbing her to death. Horrific to describe, but also to imagine that there are young children present. I think the level of malevolence and depravity and psychopathy in those actions is very clear. There are young children present. And not only can he murder their father, he can rape their mother. He can actually go through with sexually attacking and raping this woman. He's so devoid of the connection of what's happening in that moment, so lacked within empathy per se. Now, neighbours, they would later recall that they saw a vehicle that matched Nance's leave the Shook's house around 10 p.m. But then, around 2 hours later, they saw a man return. And it seems that this is when this person went in and stole quite a few items from the Shook's house. Then, he set on fire the house. Think about that. He's just carried out this brutal murder and rape. There are 3 young children in that house. 3. And he sets it on fire, hoping to prevent any evidence befalling him. So anything linking him to that crime. And he was willing to sacrifice babies, essentially. Now, fortunately, thank God, the neighbours spotted it and the neighbours rescued them. Absolute heroes. Again though, in spite of all of this, Nance is still not a suspect in this double homicide. I mean, think about all the likely crimes that he's committing, and yet he's getting away with it. So, high level of organisation. This is somebody who knows what they're doing, they've perfected their MO, they're confident in their crime. You don't get more psychologically dangerous than that, do you? As a human predator, to be able to achieve that level of confidence and also to be ready to get the gratification that's required for you when you indulge yourself in those scenes without any conscience or consciousness of impact. That's probably the most dangerous kind of human being that we could ever describe. It is a human predator, isn't it? It's everything that is potentially wrong with a human being in that person. Now, several female customers of Conlin's, that furniture store that we know Nance worked at, they actually complained that they were getting harassing phone calls, and these phone calls tended to happen after they'd received deliveries of furniture. Now, the store itself was owned by Chris and Doug Wells. So Chris was Nance's store manager. Unfortunately for her as well, Nance became obsessed with her. Obsessed with her. So first of all, he starts stalking her. And we see this in lots of stalking cases. So they collect lots of pictures. Nowadays, it's easier than ever. I mean, back in the day when you were a stalker, to some degree, it was a lot more difficult to get photographs or objects and items of people that you knew because clearly it was a harder process. Secondly, if you were getting films developed at stores and it's all of pictures of a woman walking or in situ in situations and it seems to be a little bit off, that could indicate a person having a problem and maybe speaking to the authorities about you. These days, it's way easier. I mean, you can just download stuff online of anybody's, can't you? From your favourite celebrity to the person who lives down the road from you, because it's all there, public access. So stalking to some degree has got a lot easier in that respect. But he put some effort into this. He really obsessed about her. So he had lots of pictures of her. They'd be found in his home later on. In fact, some were even taken of her just on her jogging route. He even had one in his wallet. So he's forming this relationship with her. It's not real. She doesn't have any knowledge of it. But for him, he's got this connection. And again, let me bring you back to this idea of when a serial killer is thinking about his next kill, they get almost exactly the same kind of joy and anticipation in just thinking about the fantasy than in carrying it out. I always say, human beings are massively unpredictable. So if you are thinking about what you want to do to somebody, the reality of doing it will probably be less perfect than the actual consideration of it within your mind. So they will play out these ideas before striking because they want to imagine it being a perfect kill or a perfect rape. The fact that he's got a picture of her in his wallet, the fact that he's tracing her on a jogging route, the fact he's got pictures all over his house about her, well, that's saying that the fantasy is being built. To some degree, she could be a dead woman walking, couldn't she? She just hasn't had time catch up with her in this moment. Now, with respect to Chris, who obviously knew that there was something quite unsettling about Nance, because she'd already had to speak to him about the fact that he was taking pictures of female colleagues. So she knew there was something a little bit strange about him. However, she also, like most of us probably would in that moment, just thought that Nance had a weird crush and was focusing his attentions on her and other people, and that it was just something a little bit oddball about him. Now, when we're listening to this story, we can all see that she was in mortal danger. But how lightly are you really going to think, oh, the guy who seems to be having a few pictures of me is wanting to rape and murder me and my family? It's not where your brain goes. In fact, until recently, stalking wasn't taken seriously by our authorities. It's terrible and it's led to so many people being murdered. But there was almost this belief system that, oh, it's just somebody's a little bit strange, you know, they've just got a bit of a crush on you. And it was only when it escalated to threats or indeed physical harm that people started to say, oh, well, maybe this kind of behaviour isn't acceptable. It's not acceptable at all. When somebody is taking photographs of you that you are not a willing participant in, we have a problem. But nonetheless, at this point, Chris is clearly doing what a lot of us would do and just hoping it's just Nance having a bit of a crush on her. If only that were the case. If only that were the case. Because on the 3rd of September, 1986, it's around 11:50 p.m, Chris and Doug, they arrive at home. It's 100 Parker Court. They've been out drinking with friends, having fun. Now, when they get back, they do notice that there is a truck and it's partly parked on the side lawn. They also notice that someone looks like they're huddled behind the wheel. Now, at this point, both of them have been out for a drink, they've had fun, and they kind of think, you know what, it's probably just somebody sleeping off some alcohol. You know, they're just huddled behind the wheel because they just need to take some time out because they're in an inebriated state. Now, later, Doug ends up putting the bin out, notices that the truck's gone, but he spots somebody lurking in the bushes. So at that point, he confronts the person. He says, who are you? Show yourself. Nance steps out. Now, Nance basically claims he'd been driving by and he'd spotted someone staring in at their window, so that he'd stopped to investigate this. Now, bear in mind, for Doug, he's thinking, okay, well, I did see a truck earlier and there was a guy slumped at the wheel. Maybe this story is making sense. Actually, maybe Nance is telling me the truth and there was somebody around here who was either doing me harm or was thinking about coming and stealing from me. So actually, it kind of ties together. So when Nance has that conversation with him, Nance actually says to him, look, go and get a flashlight. Let's have a look around. So Doug goes and does it. Off he goes to go and get the flashlight. And as soon as he turns his back to go inside, Nance strikes him in the back of the head with a length of pipe. At this point, he caused a serious scalp wound. In fact, Doug is bleeding profusely. But Doug fights. The two struggle, they're on the floor, and Nance, basically having the upper hand, remember, beats Doug completely unconscious. Now, Chris, at this point, hears noises, comes outside, obviously to investigate. Straight away, Nance points the gun at her. And if that isn't bad enough, he points the gun at her and then he makes her tie her husband's hands and feet together with his signature clothesline, which he's brought with him. At this point, Nance is highly agitated. He's pacing up and down. He's talking to himself. He's saying to himself he's done something really bad and that he needs to get money to get out of town. Again, going through with that same MO, because Nance then restrains Chris, carries her upstairs and into the bedroom on the second floor, ties her to the bed. We've seen this behaviour before. Then he gags her with a sock and a pair of tights. Now he's got her restrained, he returns downstairs and we've got a very badly injured Doug. And Nance drags Doug by the collar down into the cellar. He ties him by his neck to a support post, so he's completely restrained him now. But whilst this is actually happening, so whilst he's getting away with doing this, Doug regains consciousness. And because he regains consciousness, clearly he's a problem. And we know what happens when Nance is in a situation like this. So for good measure, Nance stabbed him in the chest with an 8-inch butcher's knife, punctures his lung. And in a final insult, he wiped the bloody blade that he just stabbed Doug with across Doug's trousers. Just leaves him for dead in the basement. And of course now he's going to turn his attention back to Chris in the bedroom. She is hysterical, understandably. She will have heard the commotion. She will be aware that her husband is dead or in mortal danger, and she'll probably know that she is next. She's trying to undo her restraints. She's absolutely beside herself. The Missoula Mauler was about to take another 2 victims in his signature brutal style. Or was he? The 8-inch blade had missed Doug's heart by centimetres. He was horrifically injured. Absolutely horrifically injured. But he was still alive. And he was still conscious. And wow, if there was one thing that Doug was even further enraged by, behaviour-wise, where Nance is concerned, it was the way that he had wiped the blade on him. He was filled with adrenaline, anger. Somehow in that wounded state, he managed to break free. He managed to get out of his restraints. And also, the other thing that Nance didn't realise was that Doug was a gunsmith. In fact, the couple kept guns in the house. So Doug, stabbed, beaten, bleeding, he knows he's got moments to act. He knew his wife could be killed at any moment. He knows that this perpetrator is absolutely, without doubt, willing to kill. So he has this old Savage Model 99G takedown rifle in the basement by his workbench because he'd been repairing it. It's loaded with just 1 bullet. He grabs the gun and he staggers from that basement up 3 flights of stairs to the 2nd floor because he didn't want to risk shooting Chris. He needs to know that he can see what's happening. He reaches the top of the stairs, and what he does is he bangs the butt of the rifle several times against the wall because, of course, he doesn't want Chris near him when he's got this gun. He doesn't want to cause her any potential harm. Now, Nance at this moment is in the bedroom and he is struggling because Chris is fighting. She is fighting. Now, he hears the bangs and he leaves the room to investigate, and there he is on the landing, suddenly confronted by Doug. And Doug is beaten, he's profusely bleeding, and he is pointing a rifle directly at him. Doug had 1 round, 1 single opportunity. He shoots, he hits Nance in the side, and Nance falls to the floor. As Nance crawls into the bedroom, Doug staggers after him. Oh my God, and he catches up with him. And in this desperately wounded state, he begins to smash the butt of the rifle into Nance's head again and again and again. And Nance continues crawling. He's begging him to stop, begging him for his life. And guess what? Just at that point, Chris had heard the gunfire. And she's so afraid that her husband's been shot and killed that she is struggling with her restraints, and she actually had managed to get out of all but 1 free. So as Nance crawls into the bedroom and gets within range, she begins to attack him, kicking him, punching him, taking out all of the rage that she feels for this man who has walked into her safe home and tried to decimate her family. She goes again and again and again. And Doug, he just continues to smash Nance repeatedly in the head with the butt of a rifle until it splintered. So we can just imagine how hard they are hitting Nance at this point. Now, Nance at this point is still fighting, and he manages to unholster a gun, and he actually fires 2 rounds, and the 2nd round actually hits Doug in the leg. But I tell you what, Doug doesn't care. Absolutely doesn't care. I literally think you could have shot him 9 times, but the adrenaline cortisol going through his system, he wasn't going anywhere. Doug just continues swinging his rifle at him, and actually, in confusion, he basically smashes the bedside lamp, so the whole room just plunges into darkness. So Nance then fires a 3rd and final shot as Doug swings the rifle again at him. And when he swings that rifle at Nance, it catches Nance's arm and it causes Nance to shoot himself in the head. So Nance shoots himself in his head with his own gun. Some would say divine justice, wouldn't they? Doug then calls the police. The emergency services are on the scene really quickly. Nance, Doug and Chris, with respect, to rush to hospital, but Nance died from his injuries a few hours after arriving at St Patrick's Hospital because he'd suffered 60 wounds from the beating inflicted by Doug, and obviously all the wounds that had gone with that. Now, just want you all to know that Doug and Chris went on to make full recoveries. In fact, they would both testify at later inquests into Nance's crimes. So, an incredible story of unpredictable and unwilling to comply individuals. And when we actually think about it, when they went ahead and killed Nance, all they were dealing with was the experience that they had had, right? They had no understanding of the kind of person he was before. They didn't know that they'd actually managed to do the unthinkable, because they were the intended victims who'd actually killed their serial killer. That's the reality. They were the intended victims of a serial killer, and they killed him. Doug was later quoted as saying, sorry I have a smile on my face, by the way, but there were just these moments, aren't there, where you're like, oh, you know, so many people had died at this man's hands, whether we actually can say specifically, certainly, or whether it's circumstantial, but we know this individual has killed before many times. And Doug said, I really hope this jackass last thought was, boy, did I pick the wrong house. I think that is the perfect phrase. Now, by killing Nance, without a doubt, we can all agree they had undoubtedly saved many, many lives. He would have gone on to kill again and again. However, when it comes down to it, the authorities will never actually be able to fully understand the gravity of his crimes, because obviously he's dead and a lot of the cases had gone cold. But following his death, police did begin to piece together the jigsaw of who Nance was, because he hadn't been on their radar. So apart from those early crimes where there was suspicion, it wasn't as if they were tracking him, tracing him, worrying about him. But as soon as he started to kind of piece things together, they realised that the attack on the Welleses had certainly not been an isolated incident, because it had these incredibly striking similarities to the Pounds and the Shook murders. And when the police searched Nance's home, wow, they discovered evidence that linked him to the Pounds murder. They also found items that had been taken from the home of Mike and Teresa Shook, like a small ceramic elk and a hunting knife. And Nance had given his father the elk as a Christmas present. Here, Dad, this is for you. Oh, what is it, son? Just a present. Where did you get it from? If I told you, I'd have to kill you. I imagine it went something like that. Also, the bullet that was taken from Teresa's leg was also found to match Nance's father's gun. So we have this tying of Nance to their murders. Also, after establishing her identity in 2006, it was confirmed that Michelle Bachmann had been in Nance's company in 1984, because police discovered a series of photo booth pictures of her with Nance in his home. And also, they found hair that was similar to Marcella's in Nance's truck. It was treated with the same hair dye as a sample that had been taken from her remains. So again, they could see that this was Robin Marcella. Now, it's never going to probably be known how many murders were carried out by Nance, but they do suspect he was definitely responsible for at least 6 killings. And also, we're probably never going to find out exactly who his victims were, because he was good at getting away with it. This was an organised killer who took his time, and he was an individual who spent a lot of time stalking and trawling and locking in on his victims. So it's likely that he killed many more than we're probably talking about today. But 6 is what they suspect definitely took place. Now, this guy, pretty much from the get-go, we can all agree, ruthless, sadistic killer. Yet, in spite of this personality type, managed to carry out multiple rapes, multiple murders, without detection for over a decade. When you look at his psychological profile, He's definitely an organised killer. So he was socially adept. We talked about that earlier on. He was popular. People liked him. It was only when people started to question the fact that he was involved with a crime that he started to move away from the place that he'd been brought up. Before that, he'd fitted in like a chameleon perfectly. He was above average intelligence. We know that at school, he excelled. He was high birth order. That's what we expect to see with an organised serial killer. He had the inconsistent parental discipline. His father was very harsh. His mother was an alcoholic and wasn't present in that way. Took part in animal cruelty, meticulously planned the attacks. So they are all highly organised. And we also know he used to take his kill kits with him. So he was somebody who fits that profile. However, also worth noting that at the time that he initially started carrying out crimes, DNA was not where it is today. So the scientific knowledge at the time allowed him basically to escape justice, because DNA, had it happened today, and that pair of bloody pants had been found, and they'd done the profiling that had been able to connect him sooner. Also worth noting, and this worries me quite a lot, George Nance's father defended his son after his death. Why? I mean, was it the elk? Was it the present you got that Christmas? Was it a particularly good one? Or was it just that you thought you were a terrible father and maybe you created him? I don't know. But basically, his father, quote, said, "Quit trying to pin all the crimes in Missoula on him." What? George? Your son killed at least 6 people, likely considerably more, was a brutal rapist and murderer, and you're worried that the police are like, let's just put all the shoplifting locally on him. I mean, maybe you should go, wow, do you think that my son, who's a homicidal maniac, murderer, rapist, may be responsible for more killings? Because it seems like he did it for quite a long time. No, just completely defended him. By the way, you want to create a narcissist? Bring them up that way, make them feel that nothing they can ever do will mean that you reject them. That's how to create an entitled nightmare. And a lot of us will know people who are a little bit like that. They won't be murderers, they'll just be entitled nightmares. And you'll look at the parents and you'll be like, it's your fault. Anyway, for me, in spite of this horrible story, and also in legacy to all those poor individuals who were horrifically murdered, I do feel there is some poetic justice in this. You know, he made a fatal mistake. He underestimated his victim. And the moral of this story, if I am going to bring one in, don't mess with Doug Wells. Don't mess with Doug Wells or his wife, Chris, because the chances are if you do, it won't end well for you, just like it didn't end well for Nance. Like I said, guys, when we were researching this, I was on the edge of my seat because I thought I was just coming across another homicidal, psychopathic killer who managed to just destroy people's lives without necessarily meeting a fair and just experience themselves. And I think in this case, there was certainly divine intervention where Doug and Chris are concerned, and in spite of the horror that they faced, and I mean the scars and the trauma must be massive, the justice that they feel and the knowledge that what they actually did was to protect so many others from a similar doom, that must be something that, in spite of the horrible trauma, keeps them warm at night, because they are heroes. And again, always when I talk about these stories, please don't think I'm saying that those people who fell victim to him and died deserve anything but our absolute empathy, sympathy and compassion. They did what most people do, because in the circumstances where somebody breaks into your home and threatens you with a gun, so many of us just think, just let them do what they need to do and then they'll go. And it's just testament to remembering that complying is often the thing that ends with you not taking another breath. And I think that Doug and Chris teach us a lesson here, which is it's better to go down fighting like hell than it is to accept and comply, because like I said, a killer is always going to kill you. It's as simple as that. So at least if you fight, there is a hope and a chance that you may just get away. You may break their fantasy, you may overpower them, you may create an escape, and everybody deserves that. I always say, if that's the only thing you take from my videos, That's the one to remember. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you were all a bit like, oh yes, I wanted that ending and I got it. And again, this is totally acknowledging that so many people lost their lives, more than I'll have covered today. There's no way Nance didn't kill more. There's no way he isn't responsible for more. And I hope that his date with destiny downstairs is one that is deeply regretful for him as he burns in hell, whatever that may be. And I hope again that for every victim that was lost, we just take a moment to remember that these were innocent victims, just certainly put in circumstances beyond their control by somebody they lightly trusted, only to find out that they were being horrifically abused and finally murdered by a psychopathic maniac killer. Let me know what you think. If you found it interesting, leave me a comment, give me a like. Please subscribe. Then you'll get my notifications twice a week and you'll know that I'm here and I'll just release that content to you, same time, same place. Get involved in a live premiere where we just chat with each other. Kenneth Crime Cult is growing and I love it. It's one of the kindest communities on YouTube and I stand by that and it always will be. I appreciate every single one of you watching. I hope you didn't know this case, and if you did, I hope you didn't tell anyone the ending or there'll be trouble. We'll see you soon, guys. Loads of love. Join me next time. Merch is out. Again, thanks everybody from Patreon. Thanks for everybody who comes here and views me. You mean the world. Take care. Bye.